Thank y'all for being try that again. Good morning. All right. I see my cardiology fellows in the back. They're enthusiastic. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to speak to y'all a little bit about how to write a manuscript and also how to write an abstract. I've been giving this talk a number of years, but always welcome some feedback and thoughts. So a few acknowledgements. I first heard this talk from Jeff Jacobs back when I was a fellow many moons ago. And then he had some input from a couple other people. And then I have to acknowledge my wife. She's also a big researcher. She does HIV at CDC. She gave me some input as well. So, disclosures. Number one, I do not have a degree in English, journalism, or any other field of writing. I was a biomedical engineering major in undergrad with a minor in classical studies, and then went the whole medical route. The other disclosure, I'm going to tell you my approach to writing a manuscript, but there's no one right way to write a manuscript. All right. That will differ by the person doing the study, by the person reading it, by the journal editor, depending on whether it's Monday or Tuesday, how they're feeling and what they had for breakfast that morning. Things can change a lot about whether someone thinks something's good or not. My advice to you in your stage, if you're looking for one best way or model for how to write a manuscript, just look at some of your mentors' papers. However they wrote them, write them that way, because they're the ones who have to give you your final approval and go from there. All right, so interactive portion. Why write a manuscript? Throw out some ideas. Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about it? Anyone? Well, quick raise hands. How many of you have published a manuscript before? Perfect. So some of you have some experience. So why did you do it? All right. Share ideas, make people aware of it. All right, good. So sharing new knowledge and contributing to the field. Okay. Other reasons? Advancing your career. Come on. Some of y'all did it when you were a resident, so you could look good for fellowship. That's okay, to get there. But now you're a fellow, so you also needed to graduate from fellowship. It's kind of part of your board requirement. So there's many different reasons. I'm not, going to judge why you're doing it, but I'm going to try to help you get through it. And hopefully it'll be a little bit easier than going through the traditional process of manuscript publishing. All right, when should you write the manuscript? What should your kind of timeline be? And everyone has their own little, what works for them. I'm going to give you the abstract talk later, but typically the focus I like to do, especially at your stage, is you come up with an idea for a project, you get some preliminary data, you get an abstract together, submit that to a conference. Between when you submit that to the conference and the time you actually present it, a lot of times I see people just kind of stop, right? They're not doing a whole lot and they're waiting until like just a few weeks for the conference, putting stuff together. But you should be using that time to finalize your analyses and really get to writing your paper. And I think the best thing is if you can, have written your paper, at least a first draft before you go to the conference, then when you go to the conference, you know that data inside and out, you know all the limitations, you are clearly the most qualified person on that stuff. And what's great is when you go to the conference, people will give you feedback or they'll ask you some questions you haven't thought of, then you can come right home, incorporate that feedback or make those little changes and get it out the door. Okay, I think that's a good timeline for you to think of because too many times I see just people get distracted, life happens, rotations happen, COVID happens. So try to keep yourself disciplined when doing this. All right, so we're gonna go through our top 10. It's almost Halloween. Oh, I see one person happy up there with the hood hat. I like it. I'm from New Orleans. That's right. Saints play tonight. So anyone from Seattle? No? Okay, good. All right. So you won't be too upset. We play Seattle tonight. All right, so I'm going to show you some. I didn't make this pumpkin, but I think all the other pumpkins in this one I've made. I've been adding them through the years. So I don't know what I'm going to do this year yet. I might be doing something Braves. Thought about doing Squid Game or Ted Lasso. Believe kind of Ted Lasso and Braves together. We'll see. So time to figure it out. Okay, first pearl. Focus clearly on the question. All right, and I cannot stress this enough. This is why I mentioned it first, and I'm going to come back to it later. But clearly define your question because this is going to drive everything that you do. Okay, it's going to drive how the study design. It's going to drive how you write your intro. It's going to drive what results you're going to present. You don't need to present everything. It's going to drive your main sentences in your discussion and your conclusions. And the other thing that's going to drive is trying to keep, things kind of neat and together, because we all have this tendency to, start this project, have this question, come up with something, and then someone say, well, why don't you add this? Or like, oh, why don't you look at it this way? Why don't you do something else? And as fellows, I want to encourage you, and this is hard to do, but I want to encourage you to say, no, I'm going to answer this question that we agreed on early on, and those other ideas are awesome, but we're going to do that in the next study, right? We're going to have a second question or do something else, because one thing leads to another, and all of a sudden, your 6-month project is now a full 3-year project. I've seen it happen way too many times. So try to avoid that message creep. All right, so on to the introduction. From Louisiana, so I'm an LSU fan too. Not our year, but a couple of years ago it was great. All right, introduction. What's the purpose of it? So there's a few things you're trying to do with this introduction, right? So number one, you're trying to set the stage. Why does your paper matter? Like, what's the big context here? And number two, you're trying to grab the reader's interest. Why should they look at this and read this? What you are not trying to do is give a full review of the literature, all right? We don't need a 3-page introduction where you've got 30 references in there. That's a review paper. That's not an introduction. Okay? Introduction, it's just really quick and to the point. And I hate to tell you this, but the only people that are gonna read the introduction that you do all this time on are your mentor, and then the people reviewing your paper during the review, right? The editor's probably not going to read it. Most people reading papers aren't going to read it. They're going to read the other parts, but probably not the introduction. I like to give a timeline, or estimate that 1 page double-spaced should be enough for an introduction. And you don't need it to be really long, or else you're going to start boring people. I like the funnel approach when writing it, 3 sentences or 3 paragraphs. Start very general. What's the big picture topic? Narrow it in, kind of, where are we getting to? And then your 3rd paragraph or last sentence is really going to be, here's what I'm going to focus on and to address this. So, example, paragraph 1, 10,000 foot. Why does this matter? Right? I'm going to give you a lot of examples from pediatric cardiology because that's what I know. But I change this first paragraph whether I'm applying, submitting to a general pediatrics journal or a cardiology journal, right? If I'm doing a study on hypoplastic left heart syndrome, cardiology journal, I can get really into the specifics really quick about, kids with hypoplastic heart syndrome after Fontan have all this stuff. Pediatrics journal, I'm going to start saying, congenital heart disease is a big problem. And within that, there's hypoplastic left heart syndrome. You're going to tailor it to the audience that you're looking at. Step 2, the problem and the knowledge gap. All right, so here you can start saying, some people have looked at this in this area, but this big question still remains, but these have been limited this way. All right, so why, what is missing in the field? What gap are you trying to address? And then question 3, or paragraph 3, the most important part, is the purpose and short introduction to your study. All right? I really want to see something that says, and this is going to come back again in the abstract, but I'm going to mention it because it's a very important sentence to have in your paper and in your abstract. You need to have something that says the purpose of the study was, or we aimed, or the objective, or something like that, right? And that's your key question, is that sentence, right? What is the purpose? What are you trying to achieve by doing this? I'm reading papers. As I said, I don't read the introduction, but I will look for that sentence, especially when I'm a reviewer. And I kind of like it if you state a hypothesis. I don't see this that often because usually, a lot of times it's kind of clear what it is. But if it's not, it's nice to state, what do you think is going to happen? And it's okay if what you stated was wrong, right? Those are actually some of the best papers. So examples, I'm going to give a lot of examples from fellows. This is one of our fellows many years ago. Looked at association of feeding modality with interstage mortality after single ventricle palliation. And he started saying, stuff up here like interstage mortalities and 10-20% of hospitalizations, after single ventricle palliation, difficulty feeding, because of this other issues. Limited data exists and the impact of all these other issues, right? This is kind of his second paragraph, right? Limited data exists, thus variation is the norm. So the problem is there's a lot of variation. Then it gets to the purpose. So the purpose of the study was to evaluate the association of feeding route at time of discharge with interstage mortality after single ventricle palliation. Great, short and sweet. We know why he's doing this study and what question he's going to try to answer. And then they got to hypothesis that those who got an SNG tube might, have lower mortality, and there wouldn't be any difference between just the PO and NG feeding patients. Okay. If there's a slide, it always pains me to show this slide because this guy was a great writer. This is what he started with. It was beautiful, poetic, amongst the most precarious of pediatric cardiac patients, and a tonic to this time of trepidation. And the alliteration there was like he was just killing it. Weight gain can be stubborn. I loved reading it, but we couldn't submit that. So general scientific manuscripts are supposed to be kind of straightforward, but look for outlets in your life. If you're poetic like this, use that, write it. I want you to have interest outside of medicine. Okay, on to the methods. All right, methods. During the review process, this is the most important part of it. I know that many of y'all probably, when you read papers, and I will encourage you not to do this so much as you go forward, but I did it a lot when I was at your stage, we'll kind of skip over the methods when you're reading papers and just kind of get to the point. But you really need to understand the methods to understand how much you can trust the validity of what they did. And during your review process with paper, this is going to be really, picked apart by reviewers to make sure that what you did they thought was a reasonable way to do it. Okay? Not expecting y'all to write this perfectly at your stage, but I want you to take a stab at it, try to understand it and see what happens. But your statisticians, can really help with this. Yeah.
Can I take something to the previous slide that we had up there?
That one, that's an awesome slide. No. Oh.
Yeah, the importance of what Matt just mentioned, to be bold in your writing style. It's so important. A lot of times you see manuscripts written with just pieces that have been just chopped off from somewhere and pasted. From one manuscript to the next one, it's the same old. I remember one of the best grants that I wrote with my mentor, which I still remember because every reviewer who reviewed it remembered it too, probably. This is the first paragraph we said that we, in this project, plan to turn conventional wisdom on its head. And that was our opening statement. And we put everyone on notice that this is not just a incremental thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to redefine the understanding of how a newborn feels with afterwards. Because prior to that, people thought that it was, you hang babies upside down, but with a mouth and nose, but with a gone. We were planning to turn that completely upside down. And so we thought, why not? Why not just date it to the first sentence?
Yeah. Great, thanks, Lucky. All right, so methods, how are you going to write this? It's dependent on the type of your study. I'm a fan, my style, I like in methods or results or other places, having the little subheadings. As a reader, I find it easier to find certain information when I do it. As a reviewer, it's easier to follow the progress that that the research team is doing. And as a writer, it helps me stay organized when I'm writing it. So I will often follow this kind of outline or something similar to it, adapt it for the study I'm doing. But I'll start with a study design. That's always good. What type of study design did you do? Data source, where did you get the data? Can other people access it? What are the pros and cons of that data source? Study population, who's in there, and what years? Data collection, how did you get it? Was it the chart reviews? Was it other things? What are your primary outcomes and variables? So you're going to be defining things here because everyone will define things differently. My life for the last 6 months has been myocarditis, and everyone defines that differently. Actually, at CDC, we had to come up with a brand new definition of it so that we're all on the same page. And then statistical analysis. Again, try to write that, and but your statisticians will help you with it. In the methods, explain everything you're going to present, right? But you don't need to explain everything you did. You're going to do a lot of different analyses or a lot of different variables you'll collect. It's not part of your big picture. You don't need to include it. You are not writing a lab report. You're not in, undergrad bio lab anymore. You don't need to say everything you did. You're telling a story, but story that someone needs to understand and hopefully can reproduce if they need to. But if you don't put it in the methods and how you did something or how you looked at something, I don't want it to come out as a surprise later in the results when I'm reading the paper. Right? When I have you're giving me a map, like here's the map, here's where we're gonna go, we're gonna take a turn here, turn there, we're gonna cross this bridge. I don't wanna get to the results and realize, oh, all of a sudden you took a left turn at Albuquerque, right? So let the readers know where you're going. So on to the results. This was me wanting to just have fun with a power tool. So I came up with a Pac-Man board. The Pac-Man little ghost. All right, results. Purpose of the results section is just to say what your results are, nothing less. You're not going to talk about or explain them or talk about the limitations of them or the meaning of them in the results. You're just going to present the results, okay? This doesn't need to be long. It's often pretty short. You don't need a lot of text. I think, having great tables and figures is key, and I'd focus on that. Your text can be short, and talk about that in a bit. You're only going to present the relevant data, again, not a full kind of biolab report. So what do you need to present? Well, first, you definitely have to present your patient characteristics. Who, are the patients in your study? This is often called the table one. I'm going to show you an example of one in a little bit. But the table one, someone says, oh, what's your table one? We're saying, who are the patients in your study? Right? Who are there? What's their breakdown? Then you get to the main results, kind of get into that, and then the secondary analyses. So I'll show you some examples. Tables and figures, as I said, use them as much as possible. Different journals will have different limitations to how much you can do. You can try to get creative and combine figures, so you have a panel A and a panel B or something, but use them to your advantage. Okay? And then you're going to describe stuff in the text, but you don't want to reiterate everything that's shown in the tables and figures. People's eyes are naturally going to be drawn to the tables and figures, so make sure that those are really good. And then in the text, you can kind of summarize what they're showing. Right? But those tables and figures have to stand alone, because people can and they will go to your paper in PDF format online and grab just a picture of, a snapshot of your figure or a snapshot of your table and put that in a PowerPoint presentation. No one's going to be grabbing snapshots of your text. So your table one, that's the patient characteristics. Other tables for all the detailed info. And then use figures to highlight your most important results. All right, figures stand out. They grab people's attention. Come up with good figures. Those are really key. All right, so this is another fellow, George Nicholson, who he had our record. He published 11 papers during his fellowship here. I was impressed with yours. He had caloric intake during the perioperative period in growth failure in infants with congenital heart disease. This is his table one. I'm not sure you can see it back there, but patient characteristics. He's got sex, gestational age, race, what type of surgery, and what was their underlying diagnosis, right? These are appropriate categories for the things he's looking at. Your study, those categories might be a little bit different. Most will have at least some sort of demographics, but you may have other things in there. So people know what you've got. Some table ones, if you have two groups you're looking at, you can put them here to show the differences and maybe have a little comparison there. But it's really just a good overarching view of who's your population, who are we talking about here? Because that's going to allow people to understand, is that generalizable to the population they're taking care of. So this is a figure George had. I'm just going to show part of it, but this was nice, right? He could have done a table that summarized all the weight for age Z-scores at surgery, transfer, and discharge, and listed them, or showed the median calories, kilograms per day, and median total fluids. But I think the figure just gives you a better picture, better understanding of all right, exactly what's the spread of this data? What does it really look like? I much prefer to see something like this than to see an interquartile range with standard deviations and medians. It's just, those are just numbers there, and you've got to take the next step and process what they mean. Here, it's right in front of your face, and you can look at it. Okay, so think about different ways that you can tell the same story, but in a more meaningful way. Yeah. You're not going to repeat stuff in figures that you do in your table. Yes. And you do remember what I told you earlier this year in one of our intro sessions, right? Thank you. All right. I don't like when the fellows call me Dr. Oster. All right. Anyone? Uh-huh. You can. Yep. Yeah, for sure. So, and as I said, every editor will be different, or journal will be different. I'm going through a painful process right now, revising a paper for JAMA that I didn't put all that stuff in my text because it's right there in the table. And so we put stuff like, oh, males were at higher risk of myocarditis. And the editor said, well, if you're going to put higher, then you need to actually put the numbers there in that sentence. It's in the table. Reference the table. So you just got to follow what they want. You got to do what they want. Okay. Anyone know the pumpkin? Please. Thank you. Stranger Things. Yes. So for those of you new to Atlanta, much of Stranger Things was filmed around here. If you go to the Emory, one of the campus over on Briarcliff, you'll see the Hawkins Research Lab. So. All right. Discussion. Few purposes of the discussion. One, you're going to answer the question you posed in the intro, right? That was your purpose. That was your or your hypothesis. So you start saying, hey, did we achieve our objective? Was our hypothesis right or not? Explain how the results support the answer you have, and then compare what you have to the existing literature. All right. This is not a place, to have a whole, recapitulation of your results. You're not going through everything again. Someone saw your results. And don't put new results in the discussion. Anything that you found should be in that result section. So paragraph 1, you're going to summarize your most important findings. I'll give you an example. Middle paragraphs, you can go a lot of different directions here, okay? But most things that you're going to do is 1, compare your findings to previous work, all right? Number 2, talk about why your findings are believable. Is there a mechanism of action? Why is it happening? What explains what you found? You can go a lot of different directions. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Definitely want to have a limitations paragraph. Okay, you should not be submitting a manuscript without a limitations paragraph. Every manuscript, every study has its own limitations. Even the best studies in the world, there are limitations. You should acknowledge them. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit too. And then about 5 to 6 paragraphs can usually suffice. You do not need really long discussion sections. So key sentence number 2, remember key sentence number 1 was our purpose, aim, objective statement in the intro. Number 2 is a sentence at the beginning of the discussion that summarizes what you did and what you found. I like my style. I like to see that right at the beginning of the discussion. Okay, what'd you do and what'd you find? Okay, and how did you answer the question? So an example for one of our fellows looking at neck in infants with congenital heart disease. And short and sweet start. In this study, the single largest cohort of term and near-term infants with congenital heart disease who developed neck. So he had a cool thing to say about a study. Why should we trust what he's found? He's saying, hey, it's the biggest one. We found that there was no relationship with the timing of initiation of enteral feeds or feeding velocity and the subsequent development of necrotizing enterocolitis. Boom. That's the answer to his question. Right? His purpose was to look for a relationship, and he says, we didn't find anything. All right. Middle paragraphs cite previous publications that are relevant, provide plausible explanations for findings that are different. All right. So if someone else found something different, you should say, why might they be different? Did they have a different population? Have practice patterns changed since that study? Was there a difference in the methods that y'all looked at? So try to hypothesize, why should we believe you compared to theirs, or why might both have some element of truth? Again, not a gratuitous review of the literature. You're not trying to summarize anything. You're not trying to do a whole review and education of the reader of everything in, that's been published on this topic. You should cite those relevant papers that matter to yours to either support or refute what you found. Bradfield-Hill criteria. So, many of you are going to be doing, kind of like observational studies, and Bradfield-Hill criteria are criteria which pertain to kind of observational studies or epidemiology that say, why should we believe what you found? Okay. And so these are just ideas that you can have sometimes for your middle paragraph, so what matters. So the strength of the finding, right? If you found an odds ratio of 1.1, like, maybe it's a small difference, but it's like, wow, 3.0 or 5.0, and that'll vary to what you're looking at. That's a big difference, right? Consistency. You found this. Did other people find that in smaller studies or other populations? Are we seeing in other places? Specificity, is it found particular to your question? But hey, if you don't have that one variable that you're interested in, then you don't see that relationship. Temporality, if you're saying A is associated with B or A leads to B, then you really need to have A come before B. That seems kind of straightforward, but sometimes people can get tricked up on that. Biological gradient, that kind of means I did a paper a number of years ago on like fever and flu. And so the question, in fever and the leading to heart defects. So you can say, well, if the fever is higher, you're more likely to get the heart defects. So is there an effect of the fever there? Plausibility, does it make sense? Okay? If you can't say that some sort of relationship is plausible, you're going to have a hard time convincing people that what you found is true. Skip coherence, but then experiment. Are there experimental studies? Has this been seen in the lab or in mice or something else like that? And I like to use this one a lot. Analogy. I'm doing a number of projects on like survivors of heart defects, long-term survival, and what are their issues when they're older. We'll do an analogy to long-term survivors of cancer. All right. So what's similar to people who have been through this big traumatic medical experience in their life? So when you get to limitations, you can do one paragraph on limitations. I usually like to have about 3. You need at least 2, but 3 to 4 I think is usually a good number. Identify potential biases. And important though is don't just list the limitation, but try to explain how it may have affected your findings. Okay, so because of this limitation, how might your results have differed from what they would be like if this limitation didn't exist? And importantly, why should we still believe your results? You could be limited by something, but there's a difference between a limitation and a fatal flaw. Okay, a fatal flaw means we can't believe anything that was here. This probably shouldn't have been done in the first place, this study. Rarely have I seen that happen, but as a reviewer, sometimes I have, going through a paper, I'm like, these results aren't valid at all because of some sort of fatal flaw in the study. And they just listed as limitation. And I said, I've told the editor, I was like, this just shouldn't have been done. Like the way this was done, this is not a good way to look at it. A classic example is someone's trying to identify, like give estimates of overall congenital heart defects, looking at just defects identified in the nursery. It's like, we identify defects in the clinic all the time, where people go home and come back to the hospital. I was like, you can't overcome that limitation and try to say that, the rates are down because we don't see it as much in the hospital when we're seeing it in the clinics or other places. So in those cases, hopefully your mentors have identified ahead of time what are fatal flaws of study and led you not to do those projects. One of the hardest things to say is no at times, or to give up on a project. It's okay if you realize that there are flaws that can't be overcome. Move on to something else. Okay, conclusions. Pumpkin pie. Hope you like it. All right. Conclusion. It doesn't need to be long. Doesn't need to be there though. It's going to sound a lot often actually like your first sentence of the discussion. That one it shows you can blend paragraph. You can write something just like that for the conclusion too. Hey, we didn't find anything. Okay. But here you can also talk about how is it going to impact care? How is it going to impact research? What should people do with this? All right. Harry Potter fans here? No? You'll see a lot of Harry Potter later in the next talk. All right, title, keep it simple. So let's talk about titles. I don't like really, really long titles. Can you have a summary statement of key finding? Have keywords in your title. People are searching for things there. And I have this ask a question. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the abstract one. Okay, but try to keep things, clear, but with good keywords and something easily tweetable, because people will tweet out your articles. Journals will tweet out your articles and have, a lot of times journals will like to tweet out the title of your article or a key finding and a figure. Again, back to those figures, why they really matter. Your title should be specific enough to describe the contents of the paper, but not so technical that only specialists will understand. To tell people whether they should read it or not. You know, I get every day in my inbox, you know, a bunch of new publications that have matched my search string on PubMed, and often I'm just looking at the titles to see, all right, do I want to click on this link to go to the abstract and learn more, or can I tell the title, this is something I'm not going to spend time reading right now. The work being reported should be clear to the reader without having to read the paper itself. Okay. A lot of that's on the writing the paper. And talk about some of the other process, though. So co-authors. All right, this is sometimes tough and sometimes challenging. And it sounds easy, but who should be your co-authors? Right? Who should be on there? Remember, as fellows, you should be doing projects, or at least focusing on projects where you're first author. You need something like that in order to graduate from fellowship. You can help in other ones, but I really want you to think about your first author paper. So who should meet criteria for authorship? So there are, you know, these guidelines. I'd say one, they need to make substantial contributions to the conception and design, acquisition of data, or analysis and interpretation of data. Notice number one doesn't say anything about writing or just reviewing your paper. It's got to be part of the study. Number two, drafting the article, usually that's going to be you, or revising it critically for important intellectual content. So that's going to be all your co-authors who are on there as well. And the three, final approval of the version to be published. Right? And a lot of journals will ask you to check boxes for each article, for each person saying that you're listing when you submit it. Did they meet all these criteria, and how did they? Someone wants you to be really specific. What did they do? If they don't meet authorship, you can totally acknowledge them, okay? You know, I'm going to use a cardiac example. I have these really cool pictures for a study. Hey, I'm going to acknowledge the sonographer who grabbed those pictures, right? But they're not really part of the study, but they got some really pretty images that I'm putting in my paper. So I want to acknowledge them for it. Or someone helped you get some good data. You don't really do that. Statisticians here, I know when I started, I like them to be acknowledged. I said, oh, we want to be acknowledged. I was like, you did all this work. You met all this criteria. I'm putting the statisticians as an author. And that I think is the norm and the standard, because they're helping you early on conceive the study, figure it out. They're doing analysis. You know, they should be writing part of the paper and reviewing it, especially the stats methods. So they should be authors on here. Deciding authorship, have this conversation early. First author is the one shepherding it through. Rarely can you have co-first authors. I've done this once with fellows. That was last year on a COVID project where they were both kind of getting data and collecting it all and helping to write it. Last author will be your senior author who supervised the project. And then other authors, you can figure out how to put them. It really doesn't matter in the grand scheme, you know, for promotion or other stuff, if they're kind of not first or not last, somewhere in the middle. If there's a ton of people, you can put them alphabetically, or you can go by amount of work. That's not as controversial as the first and last. When you send to co-authors, there's a tip that I'll give you. Typically for a paper at least, 2-week deadline for comments. Give them a reminder 3 days before that deadline. People are busy, get that. So you can use this language, it's totally fine. I'm not offended as a mentor when I get this language. You know, please respond by this date. If I don't hear from you by then, I'll just assume you have no comments, all right? And that's me saying, all right, my name's gonna be on this. I wanna make sure it's good. Or I'm gonna tell them, hey, listen, I got a big grant due that same day. Can you give me another week? Or something like that, all right? So it's okay to do that. All right, cover letter. Love the minions. So you're gonna submit a cover letter when you submit your paper, all right? And your first paragraph, you're trying to tell the editor, hey, this paper is important because it's going to change conventional wisdom and flip it on its head, right? Or something like that. Or it's going to change what we do, or we found this really interesting thing, you need to publish this. Or the readers of your journal are going to be really interested in this because of X, okay? And the second paragraph, though, you're just going to talk about, was it presented somewhere else? If it was, that's great. Like if you presented at a conference, let the editor know that. That gives validation that, hey, someone else has reviewed this topic at least in the preliminary work and thought it was important enough to, invite them to come present it at a conference. You can talk about whether all authors meet criteria. Some journals want that in the letter. And the third, you can suggest reviewers. Right? Different journals have different policies for this. Most journals will ask you to suggest some reviewers. You can ask your mentors for help for this. Some journals don't, because there have been a number of instances where people were caught submitting names of reviewers, which were actually themselves with alternate email addresses. So don't do that. It's like pediatrics doesn't care who you submit. They don't pay attention to it because they, will find their own people. All right. So talking about submitting, this is my pumpkin last year. Where to submit? So there's a lot of things that can go into that discussion. Where are we going to submit this manuscript? All right. So number one, who's this meant for, right? If I'm doing a project that's really meant for pediatricians, I'm looking at more general pediatrics type journal, like Pediatrics or JPEDS or something like that. It's really tailored towards cardiologists. I'm looking more at the cardiac journals like Circulation, Pediatric Cardiology, things like that. So think about who you want to read it. Impact factor comes into play a little bit here because you kind of want the highest prestige of journals. Impact factor, for those who aren't familiar with it, is basically the average number of times articles in that journal have been cited in the last couple of years, right? So journals want to publish articles that other people are going to read and find important enough to cite in their own papers. So what do I do? So I rarely think of the target journal when I'm writing the paper initially, right? I like to write the paper how I want it, how I see it fit, how I think it should be written, and the story it should tell. And then I'll go look at the list of references that I have. And if I have 25 references, and 3 of them are from this one journal, I'm going to probably target that journal to start with, or because that tells me that journal was also in the past interested in publishing papers related to this topic. So that's a good way to go. Corollary to that, you look at your 25 references and like, wow, I really think this is a good journal, article for pediatrics. I don't have any pediatrics references here. Go add a couple. You can find something. Go put them in there. So I kind of got that tip once from an editor who reviewed a paper, and all the journals have their default stuff like, oh, when you revise it, do this, make sure your figure's in this format, yada, yada. And one of them had there, wherever possible, please make sure you add references to our journal. Like, whoa. That was an editor basically asking me to help inflate their impact factor. It's a game. I get it. I'll play the game. It's fine. Okay. Did want to mention, Emory does have an open access fund. I've had a fellow fall into this and we were able to fix it. A lot of journals, they want your money, and they'll make it sound great. Like, wow, do you really want your information to be impactful and be free to everyone in the universe? And you're like, that sounds awesome. Yeah. And so you click that when you submit the paper, and then your paper gets accepted, and they come back like, hey, remember when you said you want everyone to read it? Great, that's going to cost you $2,000. Like, whoa, hold on, I didn't know that. So be careful. Realize that open access means if you give us money, we're not going to charge people to look at it. Anyone without a subscription to Elsevier journals can get it. There are some journals that are really good that do have open access, and there are times to use that. Example in my field, cardiology, JAHA, it's the Journal of American Heart Association. It started about 10 years ago. Circulation a lot will try to punt lower priority papers over to that. But it can be really good to publish that, and it's actually a really good impact factor, around 5 or 6, which is not bad for pediatrics. So Emory does have a fund where they'll contribute $1,500. You're allowed to be on one paper a year that has it. You can't be on any other paper that has it. So I usually about once a year will try to use that. I've done that twice now. It works great. So it's pretty good fun. When you go to submit, check the guide for authors. Check it early. Fortunately, this is not like ARAS. This is not like a single submission thing that you've done for your applications. Every journal is different, and they all have very different guidelines and hoops that you need to jump through, and it's really a pain in the butt. I wish there was kind of a standard format for submitting. But check, they're going to have differences in word count, format differences, their tables, figures, and all that. I do want to pause and add a minute here. There's one thing I need to add to this presentation. This has come up in the last year. and I have done this a couple of times. Preprint servers, should you submit to preprint servers? So medRxiv, for instance. I've done that a few times, and how do journals feel about it? 5 years ago, journals wanted nothing to do with that, right? They did not want stuff printed online or to print in their journal that's been published elsewhere online. Now with COVID, that's all changed, and journals are much better about saying, hey, we get it. We're slow. It takes a while, and some of this information needs to be out there fast. So I've only done it for COVID papers that really needed to get the information out there fast because I knew that they were going to affect policy or affect care that people were doing. So when we were learning about MISC, I had a fellow who did a quick survey of 30 hospitals. What's your protocol look like and what are you doing? We summarized all that and we put it on medRxiv, and people loved it because, like, great, we can see right now what all the other hospitals are doing. We don't need to wait months for the journal review process. Also, medRxiv, really through Wikipedia, though, you will see which journals are okay with you doing that, which right now is about 99% of them. So JAMA is not. I don't think New England Journal is, but pediatrics, yes. Just about everywhere else I submit to, yes. So again, I don't do it often, but in certain instances you can. Top 10 reasons for rejection. So I can go through these quickly. Selecting the wrong journal, not explaining why your paper is important, why does it matter, too much or too little background, often too much background, long introductions, again, bore people. Making unclear inferential leaps, so trying to say that your results mean a lot more than they really do. Confusing explanatory with confirmatory data analyses. Presenting too much information. Again, you're telling a story, you should try to keep it focused. Omitting effect size information. Glossing over the design limitations. Acknowledging your limitations is important. Not having a clear take-home message. And then your article not being proofread. So, proofreading. You might not be familiar with GEMS, but GEMS is the Grant Editing and Manuscript Support. It's one of the cores here in the Department of Pediatrics, right? And they help with grant editing, but also manuscripts. And on the bottom here, you'll see, one of their guidelines is manuscript. Hit the wrong thing. Try that again. All right. Manuscripts geared towards building researcher CVs are relatively high priority and will receive a reasonable amount of subsidized support. Remember one of those first slides, why write a manuscript? To help build your CV, to make you look good, advance your career. So all your manuscripts as fellows should fall into this area, okay? So use them, they're great, all right? Becky's one of the main persons. Is there anyone else besides Becky who does it? Just Becky, okay. She seems like many people because she's very fast and she gives really good comments. It's not a long turnaround. It's worth it, even if it delays your publication by a week or two. It's worth it. Because proofreading, remember George? I showed you his paper earlier. You may not have noticed that there was actually a little error in the bottom, and I'll show you his abstract. So George published this. I told him, George, congrats, well done, getting your paper published, talking about TPN and PPN and the impact of that on growth. But I asked him, what's parental nutrition? I'm like, is that breast milk, George? What are we talking about? He had put parenteral. I don't know whether Word had fixed it or the journal during proofing changed parenteral to parental. Sometimes these things come up. When you get your proofs checked. That used to be the only one that I showed. And then this one you'll see with the last author, Matthew Oster. I got a call from an email from the director of congenital heart disease at NIH, who was doing a journal club with her group and said, you might want to fix your supplement. We did a paper on syncope, and we submitted just a supplement, right? Editors and journals, they don't review the supplement. They just take it and like, oh, here you go. And the supplement was, here's the questionnaire we have. For other people want to use it. Sometimes when you submit stuff in Word and it converts to PDF, letters can drop out. So hopefully you've probably seen this before. If you see medical records when things get converted, an important letter fell out of here. I can tell that some of you have seen it already. If you haven't, ask the person next to you. I am not going to point it out. All right. So, rejection. All right. So, what happens with rejection? These are true letters I got. New England Journal once said, it's not accepted. It reflects an assessment of the merits of your manuscript. Like, you know, like Seinfeld, the whole like it's not you, it's me thing. This is the opposite. It's like it's not us, it's you. Like your journal's, your paper's not. Thank you, New England Journal. All right, Gemma. We decided we're not going to pursue the manuscript you submitted. Like, you don't need to pursue. I'm giving it to you. It's right here. Lancet was like, yeah, this would be better placed elsewhere. Like, we're not the place for you. But finally, Pediatrics said, we're pleased to accept your article for publication. That's great. Thank you. So now you've written it. Congrats. Start working on the next one. And if you can be as prolific enough and write as much, you can become like our chair of cardiology, Dr. Bill Maley. I'll show you him in a second. Final thoughts. Brevity. Okay. You don't need these to be super long. I like reading shorter articles. I didn't mention here, I should have mentioned in submitting manuscripts, I think I can add, the research letter has started to come out a lot recently. All right, some journals are starting to publish shorter things. So instead of like a 3,000 word article, they'll publish like an 800 to 1,200 word article, really focused, very short, maybe one figure and one table, not that long. Some journals will do this. I love those articles because they're shorter, they're easier to read, and they're finer put together. They totally count in my book in terms of being good published things on your manuscripts. One of the most impactful papers I ever wrote, I submitted something to circulation all about the impact of, you know, do you have a single left ventricle or a single right ventricle? Which one matters long term? Because people had thought that, hey, having a single left is better, but no one ever would prove it. We finally gotten enough data over a long time to prove it, that, hey, 15 years down the road, if you've got a single left ventricle, it's much better. Circulation came back and said, yeah, we don't want your paper, but if you convert that to a research letter, we'll publish it. Like, done. We did it. So those can be useful. Have a clear focus message, and then remember those key sentences. Last sentence of your intro is your purpose and aim. First sentence is your discussion, quick summary of what you found, and then beginning your conclusion. Again, another quick summary of what you found. All right, as I said, if you publish enough, you can be like our Dr. Bill Maley. This is a number of years ago. We were on the cover of Atlanta Magazine, which I think was talking about transplant and hard stuff, and it was transplant stuff, and it was the top doctors issue. But I just want to point out, so if you see Dr. Maley, just ask him, has hip hop lost its edge? I mean, all right, thank you all. That's what I have for manuscripts. I know food is here, so I'll let y'all get to that, and then we'll talk about abstracts afterwards. Thank you.